Welcome to Story Chat Radio. We are book editors Carly Hayward and Jenny Chappelle. Every month we watch a different movie with an eye for storytelling and novel writing.
We use our years of training and experience editing novels to break down each movie's storytelling elements to help you improve your novel in progress.
Warning, Jenny ruins everything.
Hey, you ruin things too.
So don't be surprised if there are spoilers. On this episode, we're discussing the animated superhero film Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. And then we'll end with a critique of one lucky author's query. So Jenny, what have you been up to this month?
So this month has been Christmas and also my niece's birthday. She just turned 20. So we just, I've seen my extended family so much this month, which I think a lot of people do over the course of December. And there's just been a lot of eating stuff and talking to people, and in between hiding under my blanket and trying to recover some of my introvert energy. And so to that end, I've taken off the last 2 weeks of the month, which is really weird and unusual for me. So I'm kind of in this place where I don't know who I am or where I am and when the last time I changed clothes was. But
did I shower?
I know, right? I know. So it's nice. So what's your month been like?
Basically that.
Yeah.
That sounds about right. The website is finally live thanks to my lovely husband and KJ and Raquel.
It's so beautiful. Everybody has
designers.
just done such a good job on it.
Oh, I know. It's gorgeous. I'm very excited about it. So I've been doing that. Basically, that's been my excuse this month to have that introverted time where I just kind of hide out. I'm like, oh, we need to work on the website. We can't hang out today, family. I'm tired.
Makes sense.
So it's been a good month, but yes, a lot of talking to people and eating a lot of food and presents and just tired. Holidays are tiring.
They really are. So there's always this feeling for me after the holidays. So around this time of year, I always start going okay, let's pack everything away and get this nice, clean, sparkly house again. And it really just gives me that feeling. I really buy into the whole New Year, resolutions and starting over and everything just kind of being, new and fresh. Because after the heaviness of the holidays, it just feels like a fresh start.
No, my January tends to be, oh, it's cold out. Let's just hide and read a book or play a video game and don't talk to people because the holidays were a lot.
Well, our cold is mid-50s, so we don't really get
you don't
cold
get that
very often. It's true. It's true.
I mean, I use the excuse in summer too. I'm like, oh, it's hot out.
I definitely do that.
I
definitely do that.
All right. Anyway, let's get into this movie.
This month we are talking about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse. So here is the summary. There are spoilers here, although this month not too many. The main character is Miles Morales, and he is, of course, bitten by a radioactive spider. And he suddenly develops mysterious powers that transform him into Spider-Man. When he meets Peter Parker, who's the Spider-Man most non-comic book readers are most familiar with, Miles realizes there are a lot of other people who share his special talents. So then he has to use his newfound skills to battle the evil Kingpin, who's this really huge, and I love how he's drawn in the movie. He's just ridiculously huge. And he's he's definitely a supervillain. And he can open portals to other universes and pull in different versions of Spider-Man into our world. So we meet several versions of Spider-Man from these alternate realities, and each one has its own identity, including a unique animation style. And that mixing of animation styles makes for just such a visually interesting movie, and it's one of my favorite things about it. What did you think about Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse?
I love this movie so much.
Right.
I think this might have been my only second viewing. I can't remember. It might have been my third.
Mm-hmm.
If anyone watched any of my live tweeting, I basically gushed the entire time. The art style is phenomenal. The music is phenomenal. And the writing is really, really great. I connected with like so many of the characters, which is kind of ridiculous. Mm-hmm. It's usually you just connect with the main character or maybe a side one or two. Mm-hmm. And the art style, like you mentioned, like the main art style at least combines its comic book roots with the flavor of Miles, the main character, by adding in the graffiti style that he loves. And then with the music, so a friend told me recently that the composer live scratched the music along to the movie so that every note and every like scratch hit just right with the timing of the action. So like I think they transferred the orchestra track into vinyl so that he could live scratch it while watching the movie.
That's very cool.
Which is kind of crazy.
It
and
is.
Like that attention to detail is like very clear throughout the entire thing. It's just impeccable.
Yeah, absolutely. So I remember when I saw the trailer originally, and like my first reaction was like, really, another Spider-Man reboot?
Totally.
I know. But the movie is so much better than that. And by the time I got to the end of the trailer, I was like, oh, this looks totally different. But I really second everything that Carly said. What really struck me from a storytelling standpoint is how personal this story is for these characters. Like, the family ties are so strong that it really, no other characters could participate in this plot and it be the same story. Like, it just couldn't happen. So I feel like I could honestly spend this whole podcast just fangirling about this movie, but I guess I won't.
Oh, let's just change the whole format. Let's just do it.
Let's just gush. We'll just gush. So what did you feel like the movie does really well that writers can use in their writing?
It's definitely voice, which I think we've already started to touch on just with how amazing it is and how personalized it seems. Voice is kind of one of those ineffable writing buzzwords that gets thrown around a ton, and people have trouble defining it, or they misdefine it, or they think they know what it is, but they don't, and they just kind of throw it out there. So to me, basically, a writer's voice is the writer on the page. It's like, it's your personality. It's your view of the world. It's your perspective as the writer, not as your characters. So how do you, as a writer, talk? Part of it can be the style of your writing and like the types of sentences you use, which a lot of people think is what voice is, but it's really only that in that it's the cadence of your writing and the way you sound. It's basically, voice is another word kind of for personality.
Right.
So what is your
That's what I tell
personality
people a
as
lot of
writer?
times too.
Yeah. And it's different from your character's voice. The character's voice is, what is your character's personality? And how does that differ from yours? A lot of times they can overlap or be confused, especially when it's written in first person, where everything's from the perspective of the main character. But there should be a distinct difference. And I personally tend to tell writers they need to find their voice first before melding it with the voice of their characters.
Sure. And so watching movies can be really helpful when you're studying voice. So I've talked to a lot of authors who have told me that like they hear their characters in their heads. That kind of their characters talk to them. And there's, of course, lots of jokes about your imaginary friends and all of that. But so a lot of...
not all crazy at all. It's fine.
Right, of course. So a lot of authors will have told me that their stories often start by they kind of hear the character in their head, right? So when you watch a movie, you actually get to hear those characters talk. And when you pay attention, you can see differences in how various characters speak. So their word choice, the things they talk about, how they show us who they are through their dialogue. When you watch a movie to study voice, something that can be really helpful is ask yourself what you learn about each character through their dialogue. A fun exercise can be writing a short piece in that character's voice and seeing how it matches up to the movie. It can be a great way to start to understand that voice has such a huge impact on a reader's understanding of and connection to a character.
That's a really great point.
Right. And so sometimes when we're talking about first person narrative voice, you were saying that, first person is from a protagonist point of view, obviously. So you really want that narrative voice then to match up with how they speak as dialogue. So you just need to keep that in mind when you're watching movies, to study the voice, is that it's all about dialogue. And that's why movies are so fantastic for voice, because they're all dialogue, right? We don't get that narration. So yeah.
Yeah, they definitely have a little bit of a leg up because they're all portrayed by different people. Mm-hmm. And it's kind of hard when you're the writer to show that, but then people forget that the script was probably written by maybe not a single person, but a single hive mind at least.
Right.
So they are getting that voice into the writing, not just into the portrayal by different people. Anyway, so I think a great thing about this movie in particular with voice is just like how quintessentially Miles it is. Everything from the art style, which I mentioned, and the music, all the way to the music, which I already mentioned. It's all about him, and it shows his age, his background, his interests. Now, yes, in a movie, it's much easier to show art style and music than it is in your writing. But you can learn from the movie how every bit of detail feeds into the narrator or the main character's voice. So like when Miles sings along to the music, we very much get to see who he is. And like these small moments kind of show the teenager within.
Right. Like, I have to stop you for a second and say one of my favorite things about this movie is that the teenagers really act like teenagers.
Oh, they so do.
Like they're awkward and don't always have this great sense of who they are and what they want in every single situation. And they do a great job of showing that conflict with these characters. Anyway, you can proceed now.
Especially, I mean, that goes to exactly what I'm saying. Like when he freaks out and like does something super awkward and he just yells puberty and blames it on puberty.
That's awesome.
It's so good. Awesome. And it shows who he is. That's not something I as a teenager necessarily would have done, but it definitely happened in my head.
Right.
And I think just like, and like when he when his dad is talking over the cop car microphone, speakerphone, is that the word? I can't think of the word. And he's like, you have to say I love you back. Mm-hmm. And he's just standing in front of his school so embarrassed. But he still says it. He says it back. He doesn't just turn away and run inside.
Right.
Like, those small kind of moments show us like who Miles is. Like, he's a sweet kid that does love his dad.
Right.
And he says it. But he's still a teenager and he's super embarrassed by it. So I think, like, learning from these small moments who Miles is and, like, how he reacts and how he uses that personality that he has really shows his voice. 'Cause, like, he's trying all the time. He's trying to be a good kid. He's trying to grow and learn. But, like, through that growth, we get to see who he really is because his voice doesn't really change.
Right.
He becomes more himself.
Right.
As he grows. So I think it's like that juxtaposition of like character growth with personality.
Right.
That shows really where his voice is.
Right. I love that. And so in this movie then, so like Miles, his voice really serves as sort of the analog for narrative voice because he's the protagonist and we would kind of see the world through his perspective. We do kind of see the world through his perspective. So I think I said before, one of my favorite aspects of the movie is all of the different Spider-Mans.
Oh, they're so good.
I know.
And
so
Spider-Women.
Spider-Women, right? So we actually start out at the very beginning seeing Peter Parker, who's the one from all the live action movies. And then we meet Miles second, and see his origin story, of course. But then there's also Penny Parker, Spider-Gwen, Spider-Ham, who you just can't not laugh at. And Peter B. Parker, who's another kind of sadder version of the Spider-Man we all know and love. And then Spider-Man Noir. And what makes them all work is that they all have their own unique animation style and their own character voice. So Miles, like you said, is like any teenager who lives in New York, and his voice reflects that. And Spider-Ham is so cheesy. Like, he's so cheesy, and I love it so much. I mean, his name is
John
Peter
Mulaney.
Porker. Right, his name is Peter
Yep.
Porker. How do you not be cheesy with a name like that?
I mean, you can't. It's just perfect.
Right. And so then Peter B. Parker is a little older. I think he's supposed to be around 40. And he's had some really bad stuff happen in his life. Like, he's gotten divorced. And so his voice, his dialogue really reflects that kind of midlife disillusionment that a lot of people feel.
Yeah, we really get to see it also in comparison to the foil of who he could have been with Peter
Right.
A. Parker.
Right.
Which is very interesting.
And so then we have Spider-Man Noir, who was Nicolas Cage, which I didn't realize until afterwards, voiced
So
him.
weird.
And he's just like what it sounds like. Like, he's this hard-boiled film noir detective, right down to like the Humphrey Bogart style voice. And so each character having such a different speech pattern. Yes, they have different characters who voice them. And the casting for these characters was perfect. Like you said, Spider-Ham is John Mulaney. So he has that like very comedic voice to go with his very comedic and cheesy dialogue. And so, like, Spider-Man Noir has that Humphrey Bogart style voice. And but so in addition to that, they also have distinct speech patterns, and their worldview is reflected through their dialogue. And that's what really sells the audience on all of these different versions of this one character that the audience really thinks that they already know. And I think, so for me, that's part of what really makes this movie successful. And I think it can, like, what writers can take away from that is how you can make your story successful by giving all of your important characters their own distinct voices. And again, it's, their speech pattern. It's showing how they view the world, what their past is like, what their personality is like. Because voice, like you said, always comes down to personality.
I want to get into how writers can add this into their own writing, but I feel like I would be amiss if I didn't ask who your favorite Spider-Man was in the movie.
Spider-Ham, hands down.
Hands down,
Hands
really?
down.
That was
I loved
such
him.
a fast answer.
I know. I loved him so much. I think for me, because he was the most unexpected. Even though Penny Parker, I think, is actually the newest Spider-Man for, like, the Spider person for the comic book world. She's actually the newest. But Spider-Ham is just, up until that point, the movie is really, I wouldn't say it's overly serious, but the tone is fairly dark and somewhat serious. And Spider-Ham just throws this whole other level of ridiculousness and absurdity into it that just really took the film, like, added this whole other level to it for me, this whole other layer. So that's why he was my favorite. I need a Spider-Ham spinoff.
All right.
I also love John Mulaney. So.
I mean, who doesn't love John Mulaney?
Well, who was yours?
Spider-Man Noir.
Really? Same reason
Yeah.
I'm thinking.
Basically.
He's just so different,
He's so different and hilarious. And when he is fascinated by the Rubik's Cube at the end, and he's like, what is this thing? I live in a world of gray. It's so good.
Definitely. And again, that's what, so having these characters who are so different from the other characters really adds that level of, yeah, like it's totally absurd, but I buy it. You know,
Oh,
I buy
totally.
it. So I think
I do
that's
have to
great.
say, I think Spider Gwen is probably the most kick ass.
Oh,
And
she
like she's
definitely
great.
is. She
Like,
definitely is.
if I was to team up with any of them, it would be her. But
Right.
anyway. Okay. So I guess back to writing instead of gushing, whatever. So I agree. Those distinct voices are just so good. They really exemplify how voice can be done well because you have all of these characters that could be the same, but their backgrounds and their experiences have really shaped who they are. And I think authors tend to get stuck a little bit in their own head, and everyone can end up sounding a little bit the same because they're coming from the author's experiences.
Right. I see that a
So,
lot in my editing. I'm sure you do too.
everywhere. It's not a bad mistake to make. It's an easy one to make. It's common and it's understandable.
Yeah.
So what I tend to recommend is to pick a passage of your book or do a special exercise, however you want to do it, and write it as yourself. Like, truly, how would you as a person come at this scene? How do you view it? What does it mean to you? Where is your personality? And then that'll help you really find your own voice. Put everything that you are into that passage and you get your voice. Then write the same passage as your character and really focus on what would be different. How has their background, their situation, their experiences changed how they view the world compared to you? So who are they? What music do they like that you hate? What relationships do they have that color their thoughts? All of these things can kind of lead into your personality and therefore into your voice.
Right.
And I think seeing that in this movie, you can really see how everyone's different experiences and backgrounds shape these similar characters into completely different people.
Right. And I think what makes it so obvious in this movie is that they are all some version of Spider-Man. Right?
Yep.
So it really is like you're taking the same character, but giving them a completely different voice through each of these different versions of that one character. So even if you're just taking Spider-Man, you know, you've got the two different versions of Peter Parker, and, you know, Miles ends up being like a Spider-Man, and that's not even, then we're not even getting into the different genders and, you know, Spider-Man Noir and Spider-Ham, who isn't even human. So we've got all of these different versions. And the exercise that you talked about is similar to what I said earlier, and they both reflect, so there's an exercise called character journal or voice journal that has been, I think James Scott Bell is the one who has kind of coined that usage and that term. And it really is just for any given character, think about what that character's personality is like and write a short passage that's not going to go into your story. It can be backstory. It can just be them telling about what their day has been like. It can be anything. But it's something you're not going to end up putting in the story. And that's where the freedom is, because it doesn't have to be good. It doesn't have to be perfect. It's just something you're doing for yourself. And you're just writing the short passage just to get that character's voice right, just to really nail it down. And you can do it over and over until you feel like you have a really good grasp on it. And it can really help you when you are, I don't always recommend trying to get voice into your first draft. When you're doing a first draft, you're trying to get so many disparate pieces all coming together and tie it all up at the end, all nice and neat. But so in your revisions, voice is definitely something you want to look at. And you want to make sure that you've got not only your narrative voice, but your character voice as well. And so this voice journal, character journal thing can be really helpful with that. And so, yeah, like you said, it's the difference between you write it in your personal narrative voice, and then you can also write these things in, different character voices, and it helps you to see the difference in them. So,
Yeah. I
yeah.
love it.
Yep. So I think that brings us to the end of our discussion of Spider-Man Into the Spider-Verse.
Are you sure we could keep talking about it?
We could. Let's gush some more. No, I'm just kidding. This month we have a query letter critique for a young adult fantasy manuscript. The hero is a teenager who gains powers like Spider-Man, and it's even more fitting that we see this query for this episode because, oh my gosh, is it voicey. What did you think, Carly?
Yes, it is so voicey, and like immediately I was drawn in by the voice and laughing, and I loved it.
Mm-hmm.
It just started off basically almost sort of with a joke, but like a teen angsty kind of joke,
Right.
which is really fun. My biggest criticism is that it's pretty long.
Mm-hmm.
We get bogged down in a lot of details and names. So instead of focusing on the major stakes and the conflict,
Mm-hmm.
we're getting a lot of setup.
Right.
So I think if they could tighten it up a bit, it'll shine really brightly. Setup is difficult because it does need to be explained. We need enough information to know where this story is, where the story takes place, where we're going. But I think in this instance, if we focus more on the action and the plot and less on the setup, we'll be better served. There's so much humor in it.
Mm-hmm.
And it, like I said, it's so angsty. There's a lot of use of the word suck, which feels very authentic to me personally.
Right.
From when I was a teenager and maybe now as well.
Right.
But we have like 3 paragraphs of setup that should just be one.
Right.
Personally.
Right. I
What'd you
struggled
think?
with all of the names and this, like, so much setup as well. And it feels like some of the details might be like the wrong details, which might be contributing to the author's need to make it so long, to make the query letter so long. So there isn't like a definitive word count for like the perfect query letter because it varies some by story. So sometimes when you have a really complicated story with a lot of important characters that you just can't explain the stakes and conflict without them, sometimes it does need to be a bit longer, but it seems like 250 to 350 words is kind of the sweet spot for most queries. And so I said like the wrong details. And what I mean by that is that some details make me ask more questions about backstory and world building and what exactly is happening, rather than clearing up my confusion. And they're not the good kinds of questions like, ooh, what's going to happen next? How is this character going to get out of this situation? But more questions like, how do these two things connect? How is this detail related to the details you've already provided for me? And what does that have to do with the overall story? And why does that mean that this character has to be involved in this plot? So what's hard about writing a query letter is 2 things. One is, it's a totally different kind of writing than writing a novel.
Oh, yeah.
Writing a query letter is really more like copywriting, as in you're writing to sell it. You want to create a hook, and an emotional reaction to the premise of the story, rather than, you're not writing everything out as a scene. So when you've finally gotten the hang of writing like 80 or 100,000 words of scenes, then trying to condense that into 300 words is like feels impossible. But try to keep in mind that it's a totally different kind of writing. It's more like copywriting. And then, so yeah, the other part of it is just condensing it. Just, you have this whole world and all these characters in your head, and how everything is connected, but trying to get that out in a succinct way that's going to make sense to other people is really hard. And so the most important thing you can do is just get lots and lots and lots of feedback on it. And don't be afraid to ask specifically, what is confusing? What do you not understand based on this? Don't just say, what do you like about it? Don't be afraid to specifically ask, what do you find confusing? What questions is it making you ask? So to determine yourself, though, when you're first starting out with your query, before you're getting feedback, to determine what the right details are as opposed to the wrong ones that are going to make your reader feel more confused, start by focusing on the conflict and stakes. And don't worry to begin with about the hook and writing it to be salesy and trying to, pull someone in. Don't worry about that to begin with. Start with your stakes and conflict, because that's what we need to see first and foremost. And so in this case, I feel like you did, it feels somewhat missing. Even though we have this long query letter, it feels somewhat missing in terms of the stake and conflict. Or stakes and conflict. So once you determine what the conflict and stakes are, then ask yourself what the reader really needs to know. Like, what is the bare minimum that a reader needs to know in order to understand those stakes and that conflict? And then stick to just those details and save everything else for the synopsis. Because most agents want to see a synopsis at some point too. So don't feel like you have to get all of the world building in, all of the backstory. We don't need to know all of that. Just ask, what does the reader really need to know in order to understand this conflict being the main conflict and these stakes?
I agree. I feel like there was a couple characters thrown in that are probably very important in the story, but they didn't have anything to do with the conflict and the stakes.
And we don't really see in this query how they connect to the story.
Right. So I felt like those characters could have been pulled right out and just focus, like you're saying, on what is relevant to that conflict.
Or if they can't be pulled out, then we need to know why in that query. If they are an essential part of the conflict, then that connection needs to be made. So when you're getting feedback on your query, make sure that you're asking about whether or not, the person who's giving you feedback is making those connections as well. So yeah, I think that's it. Overall, the story sounds great. And I would love to read it
in a heartbeat.
Right.
Definitely.
Right. So yeah, just, I think it needs to be pared down some. Try to shoot for that 250 to 350 word range, and focus more on conflict and stakes.
But keep that voice.
Yes, voice is fantastic.
That was really selling it. Don't get rid of that.
And along those lines, I'd actually also like to add, the only thing is, so we hear a lot about, like, I've spoken with many authors who have heard that you should write your query with a lot of voice. And I want to make the distinction that this comes down to narrative voice, not necessarily character voice. So when you write your query, it needs to have a strong narrative voice. In other words, it needs to have some personality. You don't necessarily need it to have your character's personality. It just needs to have some personality, as opposed to, so like back in my day, we would say something read like stereo instructions or an encyclopedia. And I feel like both of those things are pretty much like dated at this point. I'm not sure,
Let's say
what the
Wikipedia.
21st century equivalent is.
We have Wikipedia now. It's okay.
But anyway, so I think it's about, you don't want it to read like something that's dry. You want it to have some personality to it.
Right.
But it's more about narrative voice. Don't try to write it in your character's voice necessarily.
I was just going to say that. I've had some authors assume that adding voice into their query meant that they should write the query from the perspective of the character.
Right. Which should not be done.
Should not be done. No. Please don't do that.
The synopsis either. The synopsis is kind of the same thing. And a synopsis can be even harder to write voice into, because it's not meant to sell anything. It's basically a glorified book report, but it still needs to have that narrative voice in it. You still need it to read in a way that's interesting and shows that you're a good writer and not just, and again, it's so hard because you're condensing your whole, 400-page book down into 1,000 words maybe. But it's just about, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I do tend to tell people with synopsis, getting the plot out there and giving them the ending, which is usually what you're kind of looking for in a synopsis, is way more important than anything else in that. Like, get your voice in there and get your narrative voice in there, because you still want to be a good writer, but just get those facts on the page.
But yeah, some of those exercises that we've given you earlier about finding your narrative voice, once you find that, you'll find that it's easier to write kind of anything in that narrative voice because you've nailed it down. So, so yeah, let's talk about all the other ways we can bring voice into things. No, we won't do that.
No, let's go back to talking about Spider-Man. So what did you think about... No, I'm just kidding. So good.
Puberty.
Okay. So on our next podcast, we will be discussing the horror movie A Quiet Place, which I'm going to say right now I am not looking forward to because I get scared very, very easily.
So I am extremely picky about my horror movies. With horror books, I can get into them much easier, but I have a thing with horror movies that, like, being scared and sad at the same time is really hard for me to deal with emotionally. I don't know. So I have a hard time watching horror movies because they're almost always sad too. And so I know going into A Quiet Place that it's sad. So, like, I'm prepared. I'm prepared.
I'm not scared at all. It's going to be great. It's going to be totally fine. Let's do it.
I can't wait.
We'll also have another query or blurb critique. So if you want your query featured on the podcast, you can find the details about how to do that on our Twitter page.
You can also find our podcast on our website, storychatradio.com, or you can follow us on Spotify, iTunes, Google Play Music, or any other streaming services. And if you have a streaming service that is your preferred one and we're not on there, give us a shout and let us know, and we'll figure out what we need to do to get on there. While you're there, please leave us a rating. You can also find us on our Twitter and Instagram pages at Story Chat Radio, all one word.
Thanks for joining in our nonsense.